Good evening. Okay. I am, first of all, I want to go ahead and say thank you to the Student Spiritual Life Committee and for John Paul and particularly for sending me the email to invite me to speak at this. I was actually sitting in chapel the day that they introduced the topics, and there's some really fun questions. Why do Christians suffer? Why did you create so many of us? If you knew most of us were destined for hell in the first place. All really fun things that you get to answer in like 13 minutes. And I remember I looked over at Bishop and I said, kind of glad I'm not doing this thing. And like, I think it was less than 24 hours, John Paul sent me the email. I was like, that's what I get for saying that. But I was thankful for the topic that I got. What's the balance between grace and obedience? And it's an interesting question. And I'm probably going to go about it and I'm going to answer it in a way that you're not really expecting. But I'm going to answer it in the best way that I know how. I could stand up here and I could give you a lot of opinions, a lot of what I think about this subject, but really what I think is immaterial. What matters is what we find written in the Bible and what God has said about it. So to go ahead and dive in, the first thing I like to do is define terms. And the first thing we're going to talk about is obedience. So what is obedience? Well, if you look it up, defined, it is compliance with an order, request, law, or submission to one's authority, or submission to one of authority. So essentially, what obedience is compliance to command, especially compliance to commands given by one that is superior to you. So in our case, we're talking about commands given by God. But obedience is something that we all learn from a relatively young age. I know I did. Goodness gracious, the number of times I heard my parents say, "Don't do this," or "Stop doing this," or "Please stop doing this." Those were commands. And my parents, and I'm sure your parents too, expected you to comply with their commands. We all know what happened when we didn't. And God is much the same way. The very first command ever given, way back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, God says, "Let there be light." And what happened? There was light. Instant compliance. God gave a command, and something happened. And it's the same thing whenever He gives us a command, He expects us to follow it. He gives man 3 commands in Genesis. First command, cultivate the earth. Cultivate, take care of the garden, and have dominion over the creatures there. The second command, do not eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And number 3, be fruitful and multiply and cover the earth. What was God expecting when He gave these commands? He was expecting obedience. God has only ever expected obedience from His creatures, us included. Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 through 6. Go ahead and turn there. Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 through 6. This is God speaking to Moses. He says, Exodus 19, verses 3 through 6. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." So what is God telling Moses to do here? He says, go to the Israelites and tell them to obey what I tell them. Obey my commands. And that's just one example. The Old Testament and the New Testament are filled with examples of people who both obeyed and people who disobeyed. What do we gain from obedience? What's the point? Why do we obey? Well, look at what Adam and Eve got. In exchange for their obedience, they were granted the tree of life, the fruit of the tree of life. They were granted immortality. They were granted the presence of God. They were granted an easy, eternal life, as close to heaven on earth as we have ever gotten. What about Abraham? Turn to Genesis 22. We'll read verses 15 through 18. Genesis 22, 15 through 18. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. So what did Abraham receive for his obedience, for his faith? He was granted the privilege of fathering a great nation, a nation of priests, God's people. And what about the Israelites? What were they granted in exchange for their obedience? To be God's chosen people. We read that previously, Exodus 19, verses 3 through 6. And again, turn to Leviticus 26, and I'll read verses 1 through 13. Genesis 26, 1 through 13. You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. If you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then I shall give you rains in their season, so that the land will yield its produce and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. Indeed, your threshing will last for you until your grape gathering, and grape gathering will last until sowing time. You will thus eat your food to the full and live securely in your land. I shall also grant peace in the land, so that you may lie down with no one making you tremble. I shall also eliminate harmful beasts from the land, and no sword will pass through your land. But you will chase your enemies, and they will fall before you by the sword. 5 of you will chase 100, and 100 of you will chase 10,000, and your enemies will fall before you by the sword. So I will turn toward you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will confirm my covenant with you. You will eat the old supply and clear out the old because of the new. Moreover, I will make my dwelling among you, and my soul will not reject you. I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, so that you would not be their slaves. And I broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. What was Israel to be given in exchange for their obedience? Prosperity, peace, the prospect of defeating their enemies. But so often, we choose not to obey. And yes, we choose not to obey. We call this disobedience or sin. We talk about it a lot. What are the results of disobedience then? We've seen the results of obedience. What about disobedience? In the same chapter of Leviticus, verses 14 through 20, we see what God says to the Israelites if they choose to disobey him. But if you do not obey me, and you do not carry out all these commandments, if instead you reject my statutes, and your soul abhors my ordinances so as not to carry out all my commandments, and so break my covenant, I in turn will do this to you. I will appoint over you a sudden terror. Consumption and fever will waste away the eyes and cause the soul to pine away. Also, you will sow your seed uselessly, for your enemies will eat it up. I will set my face against you so that you will be struck down before your enemies, and those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee when no one is pursuing you. If also after these things you do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. I will also break down your pride of power. I will also make your sky like iron and your earth like bronze. Your strength will be spent uselessly, for your land will not yield its produce, and the trees of the land will not yield their fruit. The exact opposite of what he promised them if he obeyed. If they obeyed, he tells them they will receive the exact opposite if they disobey. And it's the same with us today. Romans 3:25, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And by extension, reading James 2:10, that if you transgress part of the law, you have transgressed the whole. So not only have we all sinned, we have all transgressed the whole law. We have all fallen short. And it's that makes grace necessary. This makes grace necessary. Our depravity makes grace necessary. What is grace defined? Well, if you look it up, you're not going to find a biblical definition of grace. First definition I got was if I got up here and did a couple of pirouettes from Swan Lake. That's defined as grace in today's society. But grace as we know it in the Bible, commonly defined as unmerited favor. I had a class with Kirk Brothers, systematic Christian theology. And in our book, a man by the name of Jack Cottrell defines grace as favor showed where wrath is owed. I think that's a pretty good definition, because that's exactly what grace is. I'll use Bishop as an example to show you kind of what grace is. Bishop, if I walked back there and took the keys to your car, got in your car and drove off, but you have Liam Neeson with you, so you track me down not long after, right? You find me, and you kick me out of your car and you take the keys. Grace would be Bishop, first of all, not beating me to a pulp, because that's exactly what I deserve, right? I took his car. It's right that he should feel angry. It's right that he should want to exact some sort of vengeance for the wrong that I've done to him. But instead, Bishop looks at me, and for whatever reason, he sees that without his car, I am doomed. I have no hope. I'm going to die. So rather than beating me to a pulp, and rather than driving off and leaving me there, Bishop looks at me, he takes pity, and he gives me the keys to his car. And he lets me get in the car, and he lets me drive away. I did nothing to deserve that. I did absolutely nothing to deserve the car the Bishop just gave me. As a matter of fact, I did the exact opposite. I deserved to be left standing there, probably worse. But Bishop showed grace. And God shows grace to us. We know that sin creates a gulf, a separation between us and God. So imagine, I'll give you this one last example of how grace and how obedience work together in harmony to provide balance. So albeit it's a childish example, but it's a good one nonetheless. And then this lesson will be yours. Imagine for a moment you're standing on the edge of a cliff, or the edge of a vast ocean, whatever you want. You can see off in the distance the opposite bank. And on that bank, you can see the Lord. You can see everything that you desire on the opposite bank. But you can't get there. Nothing that you do can traverse the gap between you and God. And you deserve to be where you are, because it's by your own disobedience that you're there in the first place. That's what created that separation. Grace is God looking across the gap, seeing you, and taking pity on you. And in his pity, he creates a bridge. Our bridge is Christ. Christ came to earth. Christ died for us. We did nothing to deserve that. Nothing that we have done merits Christ coming to earth and dying to create our bridge. That's grace. The bridge that bridges the gap between us and God. Obedience is crossing that bridge. Doing what God asks of you. And it's not a lot. Do what God asks of you. He's not going to tie a rope around you and drag you across the bridge. But the bridge is there. You need only step forward and cross it.